And now it is my pleasure to introduce Peter Arlett, who is the head of Data Analytics and Method Task Force, that will provide us with an update of a very super interesting workshop, Peter. It was really very interesting about the ACT EU platform. And so I'm sure that this will generate a lot of discussion and interest. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Nice to be here. I understand you're celebrating a birthday, you collectively are celebrating a birthday.
Yeah, no more cake though.
Yeah.
So sorry.
Okay, so nice to be part of it. Indeed, we had. I'm going to give a very focused presentation to provide feedback to those of you that weren't able to participate last week, Thursday, Friday, on the ACT EU, or Accelerating Clinical Trials in the EU workshop to establish a multi-stakeholder platform. So just to remind you, in fact, we haven't got a slide here, but there's a lot of work going on clinical trials. Clinical trials are the bedrock of clinical evidence. Clinical evidence is the bedrock of a marketing authorization application. And if we have good clinical trials, we have good clinical evidence, and hopefully we then have successful marketing authorization applications that get medicines to patients faster. We have the new clinical trials regulation and the clinical trials information system as the technology part pillar, if you like. And then we have ACT EU, or Accelerating Clinical Trials in the EU, which is the business change program, which tries to invigorate the clinical trials environment in the European Union. So the focus, the work, we have 10 priority actions under ACT EU, but the feedback we had from the member states is 10 is a lot and we need to further prioritize within the 10. And so the focus in 2023 is on this slide. Firstly, let's double down on the implementation of the clinical trials regulation. The member states are all hands on deck, if you like, in terms of supporting transition trials, transitioning from the directive to the regulation, as well as new clinical trial applications coming in, which since January this year have to go through the clinical trials regulation, which means the clinical trials information system. We plan to launch a scheme to support academic sponsors before the end of the year, and that you'll see when we give the feedback from the workshop that was what drove that being selected as one of the topics to do it for a deep dive last week. The creation of the multi-stakeholder platform itself, and that we will revise our work plan, and this is work that sort of starts now, informed by last week's workshop, to incorporate the feedback. And the last bullet point you see on here is we'll incorporate actions to enable clinical trials in public health emergencies. So there was not a public workshop, but a closed sort of expert workshop on the 9th of June, which looked at the experience with COVID-19, but also monkeypox. And essentially the problem statement was, and monkeypox was perhaps the most acute example, clinical trials did not get off the ground quick enough to be impactful for the authorization or the initial monitoring of particularly the vaccines. And actually, if you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, the vaccines for COVID-19, big clinical trials were not done in the European Union, and that was because of this relatively slow decision making. It's multifactorial. So that workshop on the 9th of June will also feed into a revised work plan for ACT EU. Let's go to the next slide. So the workshop itself, and if you get an electronic copy of the slides, a recording is being made available, and the link will take you through. So the objectives were to understand different stakeholder perspectives, to present and discuss the feedback from a consultation we ran in January, February, to discuss some of the specific issues, the so-called priority areas that were identified in the consultation, and I'll give you a slide each on those coming up, to present and discuss a model for establishing a multi-stakeholder platform. In other words, to talk about talking, if you like. So does a multi-stakeholder platform look like? How should it be governed? And so on. And we had patients and healthcare professional representatives in each of the 7 panel discussions. Actually, the total number of representatives was very high. I haven't got the numbers in front of me, but something like 40 over the whole meeting. So that was really rich. And let's go to the next slide. So so this lists the panelists specifically, and I won't read through the name, but these will be colleagues of yours that you're very familiar with. And maybe just on behalf of the European Regulatory Network, big thanks to all of the colleagues that spoke and became panelists. Really did enrich the discussion, and we had some very, I mean, the quality of the content was outstanding, I would say. All credit to the people that took the floor. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this, I just got one slide per session, and I'll go in a relatively rapidly. So the first session was so-called setting the scene, setting out some of the problem statements with clinical trials, also setting out what is ACT-EU, and we also presented the outcome of the public consultation. The screenshot in the top right-hand side is from the Slido word cloud, which said that people wanted simplification, harmonization, pragmatism, reduced bureaucracy. This is these are kind of common themes, aren't they? You could argue that it's the same issue being seen from different angles. The key outcomes, and this is a complex bullet point, which is capturing lots and lots of different things, but some of the key outcomes from that session were about the need for data on clinical trials to inform better planning of clinical trials, high levels of transparency, reduction of bureaucracy, a reduction of excessive reporting, and an example was given of non-serious adverse events, a reduction in complexity, reduced technical jargon, particularly in consent forms, and overall simplification of consent forms, training to understand to help understand the clinical trials regulation, simplification and navigation of guidelines, collaboration and harmonization, specific point for sponsors on the interface between the clinical trials regulation and the need for performance studies on in vitro diagnostics and the delays that is causing, integration of clinical trials within clinical practice and large pragmatic clinical trials, participation effort to be proportional to the trial, so not having trials that were over complex and collected more data than was necessary for their objectives, and a fit-for-purpose infrastructure of clinical research in Europe. So these are headlines, but it just gives you a flavour of what came out of that first session. Go to the next slide. The second session was specifically on the clinical trials regulation. I think it's important to acknowledge that a number of the panelists see great benefit, either potential or already realised, from the clinical trials regulation in terms of a single application to multiple member states and then a coordinated assessment. The transition of existing ongoing clinical trials from the directive into the regulation is a key challenge. It's anticipated there may be about 5,000 clinical trials to be transitioned, and that's a big burden on the sponsors, and also it's a big workload for the member states. The interplay again with other bits of legislation, particularly in vitro diagnostics, and then a few concepts that seem to come across quite strongly. Patient-reported outcomes, really important. And putting the patient centre stage in every step on a clinical trial, so from the planning to the conduct to the interpretation. Reduce administrative burden, help smaller health centres joining clinical trials. There was one of the healthcare professionals from Spain was talking about how the big university hospitals have the infrastructure and if you like, the CRO admin support, whereas the smaller hospitals don't necessarily have that capacity. And if we can put something in place to support them, that would increase the number of clinical trial centres in Europe. Decentralisation of clinical trials should be enabled, simplification of documentation, and maybe sharing a platform or creating a platform for knowledge sharing of good practice between clinical trialists and centres. Let's go to the next slide. So still on session, this is now de facto a separate session on ethics in clinical trials and ethical approval of clinical trials. The first bullet point, I think, is perhaps the most important. There seemed to be unanimous support from stakeholders, including multiple ethics representatives, that we need an EU platform for ethics. So a platform that can share best practice, that can drive harmonisation, that can speed up ethics review. And I think the Commission was sitting there, the EMA was sitting there, leaders from the national competent authorities were sitting there. I think it was well heard, and I don't want to preempt the response, but I think the European Regulatory Network cannot ignore this request. Scientific advice may need more ethics participation, MREC participation. MRECs should ensure there's meaningful engagement and inclusion of patients in the community in the protocol development. Training is needed, as well as regulatory harmonization between ethics bodies, I think is what is meant here. Need for common understanding of ethic review standards, and need for MREC's flexibility proportional to the risk. For example, if you've got a repurposing trial, you already know the drug substance, the product extremely well. Maybe we don't need quite the same level of scrutiny. So those were some of the messages coming out of that session. If we go to the next slide. So transparency, it's still the same session, but de facto it was a different topic. You'll be aware, in fact, today, is it the 28th today? Yep. The last day of the public consultation on the transparency. So if you're having a little moment of you want to be distracted, fill out the survey. It takes about 20 minutes, I think. Maybe in the coffee break this afternoon, because we're closing tonight. I think it's midnight, this consultation. And this is a profound review of the transparency rules. We're not just talking about making moving a few commas and so on. A message that came across strongly from particularly commercial sponsors, but it seemed to be echoed by different stakeholder groups, was that transparency should be purposeful. Transparency for transparency's sake is perhaps less useful. Why do we want transparency? Is it about enabling patients to enroll in a clinical trial? Is it about informing on the design of a protocol for another sponsor who's designing a study? These sorts of things. And there was a quite strong feedback that a lot of the documents that are currently foreseen to be released through the CTR system are not terribly useful to stakeholders. However, timely transparency was also considered critical. I'm jumping around the slide a bit here, but there's been criticism, and it's been quite public criticism, of the deferral mechanism, where particularly the protocol might not be made public for, I think, up to 7 years after the approval of the clinical trial by the authorities, and that's not considered terribly helpful to patients or other investigators, and that came across quite strongly during the discussion. Patient trust is needed for patient involvement, and that's underpinned by transparency. Transparency with publication of negative trials is important, and of course that is assured actually under the current transparency rules, because a summary of the results has to be made available. But its importance was considered, and I think there was a slight confusion in the discussion between publication in a peer-reviewed journal versus publication in a register like CTIS. But anyway, important that negative results as well as positive results are published. Balance between transparency and commercial confidentiality. Not surprisingly, the commercial sponsors emphasise this very important point, and it is enshrined in the clinical trials regulation that we have to respect commercial confidentiality. Let's go to the next slide. We then had a really interesting discussion on supporting non-commercial clinical trials, and I was taking photographs of the screen because there was lots of really innovative ideas coming out from some of the academic sponsors. So this is not totally comprehensive, but some of the ideas that we need signposting to help academic sponsors through the complexity of getting a clinical trial up and running, possibly a regulatory help desk. Literally a telephone line or an email where people can phone and say, what do I do next? Multinational infrastructures that need to be developed. So again, it was a comment that often infrastructure in a particular university hospital will be set up to deal with the systems in that one member state. But then if they want to take a clinical trial into a second member state, they just don't know how to do that. So maybe we can put some infrastructure and some learnings and some tools in place. Fractured funding needs to be addressed. Timing of funding is not always in line with the clinical trial timelines. And there was a comment that sometimes the funding does not include the regulatory bit. And let's be clear, putting in a clinical trial application in itself requires work. And whereas the funding might not always cover that. Methodological guidance to address operational barriers to incorporate clinical trials in clinical work. So this is the pragmatic clinical trials and the interface with real world data. Availability of trial data to guide research. So, and actually, maybe I can just make a pre-announcement that we do foresee having a dedicated multi-stakeholder workshop in the autumn on data from clinical trials, and we will be advertising that through this forum or these fora over the coming weeks and months, and reaching out to many of you to participate. So the question would be, what are the research questions that could be addressed if only you had comprehensive access to data from clinical trials. So we're not talking about necessarily the raw data from the clinical trials, the patient level data. We're talking about data on the design of a clinical trial, on the endpoints, on the results of the clinical trial at summary level, whether the clinical trial led to a successful marketing authorization application, that kind of stuff. And we had some really interesting comments came out, and it shows to me the benefits of a multi-stakeholder approach, because for me it was all about what designs lead to a successful marketing authorization application. But we had some comments from some of the patients, for example, as in tell us which clinical trials had patient engagement in the design phase. For these sorts of questions, they're just different questions if you ask people with a different perspective, and I thought that added quite a lot of value. Harmonization between countries and regulations is needed. Need to build on existing information and data sharing, and lots of comments, not just last week, but also when we were talking about COVID and monkeypox, about site agreements being a huge burden when you're trying to do multinational clinical trials. And if there could be template site agreements that have got high level of consultation and buy-in as then sort of almost like downloadable tools, so that the sponsors don't have to reinvent the wheel each and every time. Next slide, please. We're nearly there, chairs, nearly there, promise. We then had a session on scientific advice, the interface of scientific advice and clinical trials approval. And I think this forum knows very well what we mean by this, but I'll just reiterate, scientific advice is when, particularly at European level, is when a usually commercial sponsor, sometimes non-commercial organization, comes to the European Medicines Agency and says, I want to generate evidence for a successful marketing authorization dossier. This is the design of the evidence that I'm planning. You might have a bit of real world evidence, but it might have a few questions about the manufacturing part, but then often it's about clinical trial design. And do you think that a placebo controlled or an active controlled or a 3 arms or this sort of stuff, and is going to, but the question is specifically, would generate evidence that might lead to a positive marketing authorization application. In contrast, questions on the logistics of getting a clinical trial approval is usually done at national level. And because of this two-layered, a European level and a national level, sometimes applicants or companies or academic sponsors are getting different answers from different parties, and that can be very confusing and slow things down. So the idea is that we try and bring these two together. So some of the outcomes of the discussion were that patient-reported outcomes are important, and patient-relevant data needs to be validated by patients. The paths need to bring in data collected by patient organizations, and patient involvement should be at all stages of the process. Harmonization of procedures, I guess that's between European level and national level. Joint advice, if possible, including health technology assessment, and ethics. And just if you're not familiar, SNSA is the Synchronized National Scientific Advice. It's a pilot program that the member states are trying to run, where you go and get advice from more than one member state at the same time. And it's focused on pre-clinical trial application advice. So that can we bring in HTA and ethics into that advice? Training is needed on how to reach regulators and understand the processes. And some kind of scientific advice navigator is needed, some kind of signposting. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is the last session. It was on building a multi-stakeholder platform for Europe. So the key outcomes was there's broad stakeholder involvement, that we need to involve funders as well as the other stakeholders that had been identified, because funders were not overtly on the list that had been pre-identified. Broad agreement to form an advisory group where all the different stakeholder bodies are represented that can then advise ACT-EU and its multi-stakeholder platform, particularly on how to optimally engage the different stakeholder groups. That there should be shared leadership among stakeholders with an equal voice. That all of the work should be patient-centric. Research with patients versus on patients was a phrase that came out a lot. That the work of the multi-stakeholder platform should have high levels of transparency and the ability to engage stakeholders on diverse technical topics. That it should have clear performance indicators, both for the engagement with stakeholders itself, but also more generally performance indicators for clinical trials in Europe. And that we hadn't put it in our proposals, but particularly industry said that we should foresee ad hoc groups with a multi-stakeholder membership, and we could also run pilots through the multi-stakeholder platform. And finally, the platform should be used for sharing of information and collaboration. So I think this is just a graphic that puts that together. If you just, it's quite a complex slide. Maybe just look at the bullet points on the right-hand side. So the form of the multi-stakeholder platform, understanding that Act EU is Commission, EMA, and the member states, and has 10 priority actions, and which report to a steering group. In addition, we would then have an advisory group, which was multi-stakeholder. We would embrace stakeholder communities, and they would work with these different priority actions. We would have a big annual event where we brought all the stakeholders together, which would essentially be following the model of last week. And then we would have a series of business processes that we would work up that would underpin the activities, processes for consultation, processes for putting workshops together, etc. And then over the next couple of years, we would have a series of topic-specific events. So I talked about the data workshop in the autumn. We've got a GCP workshop in 3 weeks, 2.5 weeks' time. There's a methodologies workshop in the autumn, and we would continue these topic-specific workshops going through 2024. Now, this, just to emphasize, this is just a model for the next year or two. I think some of our stakeholders would like us to be more ambitious, particularly with focus groups and subgroups, and more, but we need to understand that we're absorbing all of this with current resource. So we want to go step by step, learn from what we're doing, and maybe it can build and evolve over time. It may be that in 3-4 years' time we find some external funding and even have a much more ambitious program on clinical trials and stakeholder engagement. But obviously that would be funding dependent. I think if there's one more click, it may be the last slide. Okay, let's not read through this, but the advisory group would be central to this. Let's go through the conclusions. You go through the conclusions one. So listening to the stakeholders, there's high interest in harmonization, simplification, and patient centricity. The need to focus on developing impactful clinical trials that are context appropriate, purposeful transparency, going faster and further together, and agreement is needed. Agreement on the need for a European platform for ethics committees was a strong recommendation, and agreement on a multi-stakeholder platform a strong recommendation. And these things, I'm sure, will happen. The multi-stakeholder platform, I can guarantee, will happen, and we're aiming to have that advisory board formed before the end of the year. On ethics, I have high confidence it will happen, but obviously we need to discuss the who does what with the European Commission, and we have debriefing meetings over the coming weeks. I think that's it, Chair. Just one more. Well, there you go. Next steps. I keep anticipating the last slide. So we will publish a report. We will debrief with the Act EU governance. So that's the steering group. In fact, we have a meeting this Friday of the steering group. We will finalise selection criteria and a mandate for the advisory group. And I would anticipate that advisory group will have its first meeting before the end of the year. To reiterate again that the consultation closes tonight on clinical trials transparency, and just then the sub-bullet points are some of the events to watch out for. 13-14 July, GCP, data workshop, it's in the almost certainly in the fourth quarter, and methodologies workshop also fourth quarter. Thank you.
So thank you so much for, first of all, for summarizing a day and a half, very big meeting in 25 minutes or less. So thank you so much.